So it's a few minutes after the hour. I want to welcome everyone to our Longevity Center webinar today on cannabis, aging, and major life crises. So in the past 2 decades, we've seen a tremendous increase in marijuana use in people, particularly in the 50-plus age group. The scientific evidence shows there's potential benefits of cannabis use for people who suffer from a variety of conditions, chronic pain, anxiety, insomnia. But we've got limited data to guide use among older adults. On top of that, we've got a pandemic crisis, and that is raising a lot of concerns about excessive use, its effect on the immune system, and many other issues. Today, we're going to have a conversation about these important topics. But before I introduce our guests, I wanted to remind everyone that they have an opportunity to ask questions as we go forward. If you just hover your mouse at the bottom of the Zoom page, you can see a Q&A section. You can type in your questions. We'll try to address as many as we can. I want to thank those of you who already posed some questions in advance. We'll try to get to those. Also want to thank our Longevity Center staff, our board of directors, the Semel Institute IT team for their support. And as most of you know, these webinars are brought to us, to the community, and they're free. But the Longevity Center does rely upon philanthropic support for our educational programs. So if you're interested in making a donation, please visit our website at longevity.ucla.edu and click on the support tab. Also, after the webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to a recording of today's conversation and a link to where you can donate directly. So now let's move on to meeting our guest today, Dr. Ziva Cooper, who was recently recruited here to UCLA from Columbia University in New York to take on the position as research director of UCLA Semel Institute's Cannabis Research Initiative. Ziva is an associate professor of psychiatry, and her research addresses both the therapeutic potential and adverse effects of cannabis and chemicals in the cannabis plant. Her current projects focus on understanding differences between men and women in their response to cannabis, the potential for cannabis constituents to reduce opioid use, and the therapeutic effects of cannabinoids. Dr. Cooper served on the National Academies of Sciences Committee on the Health Effects of Cannabis and is an associate editor of the American Journal of Drug and Alcohol Abuse. Welcome, Dr. Ziva, to our webinar. It's great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me, Dr. Small. It's wonderful to be here.
So it's great. I really see this as an opportunity to continue some of the conversations we've been having offline about cannabis research, about some of the issues in aging. And this will be the first time we're going to have an opportunity to really look at it in terms of this pandemic crisis. But to get started, let's just begin with a general question. You know, we hear all these terms thrown around: cannabis, cannabinoids, hemp. Let's start with, what is cannabis?
That's a great point to start with, because frequently we get questions about, can cannabis do this? Can cannabis do that? What are the bad effects of cannabis? And what we have to understand is that cannabis is a word that encompasses many different chemicals and many different ways to use those chemicals. So the cannabis plant has hundreds of chemicals in that plant. Some of those chemicals are unique to that plant, meaning that no other plant has those chemicals, and those are called phytocannabinoids, or cannabinoids for short. And I'll tell you about some of those cannabinoids in a minute. In addition to those cannabinoids, there are other chemicals in that plant that are shared with lots of other plants and fruits and vegetables, and these are called terpenes. And that's what makes cannabis and other fruits and vegetables and plants smell and taste a certain way. So the effects of the cannabis plant are due to all these different chemicals. And it could be due to these chemicals given alone, so one predominant cannabinoid or terpene, or it could be the combination of all of these chemicals together. And so some cannabinoids that we hear a lot about in the news are THC, tetrahydrocannabinol. And THC is that chemical in the cannabis plant that gets people high, that is responsible for some of the memory impairing effects. But it's also known to have some therapeutic effects as well. The other cannabinoid that we're hearing about all the time now is cannabidiol, also called CBD. And we're hearing a lot about cannabidiol now because there's a great industry that's been built around this cannabinoid. And this cannabinoid in particular has gained a lot of popularity and a lot of interest because unlike THC, it is not intoxicating to our knowledge. It's pretty safe. There are some risks associated with it. And there's been a lot of studies in animals suggesting that it might be helpful in a variety of different conditions.
So if I could just ask a question about CBD, it's interesting to me. I always thought because it didn't have psychic effects, or it didn't make you high, it had no psychic effects. But I was looking at the literature and I saw some studies that looked at people with speaking anxiety. One of the biggest anxieties people have is public speaking. And in these studies, they gave 600 milligrams of CBD, 300 milligrams for speaking anxiety. And they found that 300 milligrams really helped. 600 didn't. And there was one study comparing it to 10 milligrams of Valium. And the CBD was as effective in reducing public speaking anxiety as the 10 milligrams of Valium without the sedating.
So Gary, that particular study, I think, set off a string of other studies and a string of interest in understanding how cannabidiol, CBD, can be helpful for anxiety. Now, what you said before about CBD not having psychic effects or not having psychoactive effects, people usually refer to CBD as not having psychoactive effects because when people take it, they don't feel an immediate response. They don't feel that intoxication that people get from THC. But if you look at some of these studies that have been done in humans and more so in animals, you can see that there are ways that CBD interact in the brain to modify mood, to modify sleep, to modify pain response, and as you're pointing to, anxiety and stress. Another thing that you noted was the very high dose that they were looking at in that study. They were looking at 300 milligrams of CBD. And that's very different than the 10 milligrams or the 20 milligrams that are usually sold at common dispensaries.
So, a lot of people, that's quite interesting. A lot of people think about cannabis, and it's easy for me to say, but, and they wonder, how should I ingest it? Should I eat it? Should I smoke it? Should I take tinctures, gummies? And they're very curious, what are the pros and cons of each of these modes of consumption? Maybe you can just set
Yes. And so when we talk about cannabis, we're talking about the different chemical constituents, but we're also talking about the multitude of ways that people are using it right now. You've mentioned smoking, you mentioned topical, you mentioned a tincture. There's also CBD infused pillowcases that you can buy online, CBD infused athletic wear. You can get athletic, performance shakes with CBD in it. So with this rising interest in CBD, because it's not intoxicating, it's not impairing, and because there's all these different reasons why people think it might be therapeutic, we have an array of different ways that people can use it. They can eat it in gummies, they can put it under their tongue. And the question is, does the effects differ based on how you use it? And most certainly, as pharmacologists, as people who study drugs, we know that one of the principles of drug effect is how are you going to introduce it into your body? And if there are ways that effectiveness can be improved if you take it one way or another way. Now, the thing about CBD is that even though it's widely popular and you can go to your local Gelson's or Whole Foods and get CBD infused hummus or sports drinks, the scientific data hasn't yet looked at all these different ways that people are using it. In fact, the topical CBDs that a lot of people are reporting using has never been looked at using rigorous experimental procedures where participants rub the topical on their hand and we look at the concentrations of cannabidiol in blood to see if it's actually permeating into the body and seeing if it's having an effect on pain. So we have really big gaps in our knowledge about what is the best way to use cannabidiol to improve effects and decrease potential adverse effects.
This is one reason that I've gotten so interested in this topic because, I see older patients. I mentioned earlier how the older age group, these people are really adopting use more rapidly than probably any other demographic at this point. And some of those areas are with chronic pain and other problems that are very common as we age, age-related illnesses. And there's just so limited research. I struggle with how to advise people. In fact, one of the advanced questions somebody asked, is there some kind of rule that doctors aren't supposed to talk about cannabis with their patients? Do you want to comment on
that? So that's interesting. And I think part of the rule in part stems from the fact that not only do we not have good information or good data from high quality studies, but part of this rule stems from the fact that the products that people are taking or the products that are currently available in your local dispensaries right down the street, regardless of what state you're in, we don't know the product integrity of those products. We don't know what's actually in the products. And this is especially relevant, with CBD these days, where it was recently reported that up to 60% of those cannabidiol products are not accurately labeled. And about 50% of those products actually have THC, that intoxicating component in those products, even though it's not referenced on the label. There have also been studies showing that there are other dangerous chemicals in these products. So in California, we're lucky because there is some state oversight with respect to what's happening to these products and the testing, but not all these products are adhering to those rigorous standards. And, as a physician or as a clinician, I imagine it would be very difficult to tell your patients, this product is better than that product, because we don't have the correct oversight or the correct testing that is happening with other types of supplements or other types of pharmaceuticals that people take.
So we really have a long way to go in terms of the regulatory environment, quality control, and that's a concern. So as a doctor, there's nothing I can recommend. I mean, are there certain dispensaries that are registered and others that are not? Certainly, the consumer probably should be more suspicious of someone on the street trying to peddle something versus a dispensary that appears to be more legitimate.
Yeah, and this is a good point too, because you raised the issue in California state, and I know that you have listeners from all over the country and maybe even internationally right now. But in California, there are regulated dispensaries and regulated producers, and then there's unregulated producers and unregulated dispensaries. And people should rest a little bit easier knowing that these regulated dispensaries have to meet a very high standard. And in fact, I think California has the highest standard compared to other states. So that does give patients a sense of comfort, or that gives people a sense of comfort, knowing that what they're reading on the label is hopefully more accurate than going to an unregulated dispensary. Now, that being said, even though those products are held to a higher standard of testing, we're still left with the question of how can people use these products safely And do they also treat the disorder or the symptom that they are experiencing? And how does a doctor advise them? What are some of those risks that people have to take into account? And some of those risks might have to do with the patient's age. It might have to do with underlying disorders, other pharmaceuticals that your patients are taking, which might interact with cannabidiol or the THC. So these are really important questions that warrant a conversation between patient and physician, even though a physician can't say at this point, oh yeah, take 10 milligrams of cannabidiol, this brand, it'll help you go to sleep. At least the physician can have a well-informed dialogue about what some of the risks are and what some of the drug interactions are that the patient should be aware of.
So before we delve into risks in a little more detail, let's talk about potential benefits. And I know there have been meta-analyses or review articles on the different studies that have been done. And in fact, I think there's a certain form of epilepsy where there's actually an indication. So can you talk about the level of evidence for different kinds of problems, ranging from pain to epilepsy or other?
Yes. So some people don't realize that there are actually FDA-approved cannabinoid medications. So as far back as the 1980s, the FDA approved a form of THC, that chemical that is responsible for intoxication. They approved THC for nausea and vomiting and appetite stimulation associated with some disorders. So that was a pretty big deal, essentially. They are saying that this chemical from the cannabis plant, even though the cannabis plant is illegal, this chemical we are approving and can be used for prescription purposes. And then from that, another pharmaceutical that is based off of THC was also formulated and is now also available as a prescribed pharmaceutical for those same indications. We also know with respect to THC, although it's not FDA approved in the United States, there are indications in Europe and Israel and Canada where combinations of THC and cannabidiol have been approved for certain types of chronic pain, as well as multiple sclerosis. So there's a great deal of evidence supporting those indications with THC. About 2 years ago, cannabidiol, CBD, that's made according to a proprietary method, was also FDA approved for certain type of seizure disorders most prevalent in pediatric populations. And that was a really significant event because it was the first time in 20 years that the FDA approved a cannabinoid. And it was the first time that that cannabidiol, CBD, was approved for a indication. Even though 1 out of 5 US citizens is using cannabidiol, the FDA has only approved this one indication. It was also landmark because the cannabidiol there was taken from the cannabis plant. It wasn't synthesized in the lab. So it was a big step forward, and that just happened 2 years ago. Other indications that we know cannabidiol might be helpful for, like you said, there have been studies looking at anxiety and stress, although those doses of cannabidiol are very high. There have been some studies looking at cannabidiol's effects in patient populations with schizophrenia. There have also been some studies looking at cannabidiol CBD for certain substance use disorders. So there have been some fairly rigorous studies thus far, but some areas that are becoming increasingly of interest have to do with age-related disorders such as Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, also sleep and pain. Thus far, there have only been 2 studies looking at cannabidiol for pain. So these are areas that we really have to start looking into.
I want to ask about the pain, but before we get there, you reminded me of the possibility of maybe it benefiting brain health, because this got me interested, because if you look at the biological effects of these chemicals, they're anti-inflammatory, they're antioxidant, they may do other things to protect the brain. Do you think there's a possibility at the right dose, the right kind of person, maybe not someone with advanced Alzheimer's, but maybe somebody at risk, that we could figure out a way to protect brain health using cannabis?
I think that this is an excellent question to ask as we move forward, because again, in the animal literature, there's a lot of compelling data with both CBD and surprisingly THC, that both of these chemicals can either prevent neurotoxic effects or slow down neurotoxic effects that come along with aging. In fact, there was a really interesting study a couple of years ago that looked at young adolescent mice and then older mice. And both groups received THC, again, that intoxicating component. And what happened in the adolescent mice is that the adolescent mice, when they took the THC, their memory plummeted, their learning plummeted, it had really negative effects. But when that same dose of THC was given to the older mice that already had some cognitive, issues, lack of memory, issues with learning, they actually had enhanced cognition, enhanced memory, enhanced learning. It was a really interesting study that shows the importance of a drug's effect across the lifespan. And so, those studies haven't yet been done in humans for obvious reasons. There's a lot of regulatory, ethical considerations, but that's one example of a study that's been done in this area. There's a lot more research coming out of the animal lab that we should be looking to. Also, you mentioned in the beginning, Dr. Small, that there's been a really sharp increase in prevalence of cannabis use among people 50 and older and 65 and older. In fact, there's been a 400% increase over the last 10 years. So what's happening is there's an experiment happening right now, and we are seeing, the aging population starting to use these products. So it will be interesting just to see how the use of these products impacts health outcome over time.
That animal study you just mentioned, looking at age effects, reminds me of a study that Ali Berggren, Susan Buchheimer, and I did a few years ago, where we looked at MRI scans, look at the size of the hippocampal memory center in the brain and underneath the temples. And we looked at people who were heavy cannabis users in their youth. So people who went to Woodstock and were smoking a lot of grass back in the day versus those who were pretty much drug-free. And it wasn't a pretty picture. That early adolescent and use in the 20s led to smaller hippocampi than compared to those who never used it. So I think timing is very important. Dose is very important. But this, again, was a retrospective study. So we still have a lot to learn to kind of look at these issues prospectively, as has been done in animals. So let me get back to pain, because there's a question that came in while we were speaking. And the question is, what's the most effective CBD? What's the most effective way to deal with pain? Is it CBD alone or a combination of CBD and THC? And should it be a topical or should it be a tincture?
So what I can tell you from a researcher is that at this point, we don't know very much about cannabidiol's effects, CBD's effects on pain when given by itself. And we really don't know anything about the topical formulations based from a rigorous scientific study where some people are getting placebo and some people are getting CBD. If you ask people, if you do a survey and you ask people to report on their effects after they use CBD topically, you will see that a lot of people say that they have beneficial effects when they use topical CBD or oral CBD for pain. I mean, when I come to dinner parties and people find out about what I do, some of the deepest conversations are related to how they are using this magical topical CBD, and it's helping their arthritis that has never been responsive to any other therapeutic. And so these are the reports that we're hearing, and these are the reports that are really spurring the high-level sophisticated studies that we're trying to do to understand, can CBD help with pain? What types of pain can it be helpful for? For instance, we have a study now looking at CBD and rheumatoid arthritis. And also, what is the best way to use CBD? And if you add some THC in there, do you get an even stronger response? Now, with respect to THC, we do know that THC is helpful for certain types of pain. And when you add some cannabidiol to it, it is still helpful. It doesn't detract from the pain relieving effects of THC. Now, if you use THC topically, we still don't know about its effects, but we do know that oral THC with some CBD is helpful for certain types of pain.
So, you describe what it's like for you when you see people at a dinner party and they hear about your topic. And I've got to say, we had a tremendous response to this webinar. We had over 500 people register. So, as a clinician, if somebody tells me they're doing this and that, I kind of, because I don't have the data from double-blind placebo-controlled studies, what I can tell them is we don't know. And you may find that that topical CBD cream or ointment is helping you, or it may just be a placebo. There's no way to know. We do know from many studies, drug studies, for example, that 30% of the time, placebo works. It's temporary. So
right.
We may be wasting our money, but I think the other issue, let's get a little bit towards the side effect part, is, when you go to medical school, they say at first do no harm. We're always concerned about side effects. In fact, one of the people who had an advanced question, she's a person who's been suffering from stage 4 ovarian cancer. And she went through chemo and surgery, having terrible nausea and appetite loss, lost about 25 pounds. A friend of hers gave her some marijuana, and her appetite improved and her weight stabilized. And now she's concerned. She's going through another round of chemo. Does she have to be concerned about the interactions of the chemotherapy with the different cannabis products?
So I think that getting back to your point about do no harm and this idea of placebo effect, and how placebo effect is really fine, provided that there aren't risks associated with that placebo effect based on that, the drug that people are taking. And so in this case, with your respondent or your audience member who's undergoing chemotherapy, there's some indication that these chemicals in the cannabis plant, CBD and THC, they might actually interact with chemotherapy, and it might change levels of the chemotherapy in the body. And while THC is actually approved for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting at certain doses, it's always important to talk to your physician and pick their brains about, is it safe? Do we have to worry about how the chemotherapy is going to interact with this cannabinoid, with these, with CBD or THC? Because what you don't want to happen is for that chemotherapy blood level to go up to a toxic level because the CBD is interacting with it, or for the chemotherapy to become less effective. So it really is an important question to ask your clinician. And if your clinician doesn't know how to respond, then you can ask your clinician for guidance about other people that might be able to help you in this area. But I really do think that having an open dialogue is really integral in maintaining patient health and safety.
Well, let's, I see I knew this would happen. We're a half hour in. I've got 37 questions in the queue below my own questions, and we haven't really gotten into the pandemic yet. So we're gonna have you come back in the future so we can delve
Part 2, I think it'll be great.
So the pandemic, I mean, this is, the stress levels are crazy. I did an interview earlier today on CNN about the mental health consequences of it. We're concerned that people are going to drink too much. They're going to use too many really harmful drugs. heroin, opioids, and so forth. So let's just start with that. Is there evidence that, say, marijuana can help us in terms of this opioid epidemic?
Oh, so the opioid epidemic is a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. It's an area of research that I'm heavily involved with. And, you know, it's interesting because there's been a lot of conversation about if it's possible that medical cannabis can be used in place of opioids for pain. Is it possible that medical cannabis can be used to help wean people off of opioids, whether they're experiencing pain or whether they have what we call an opioid use disorder, if they're have problematic opioid use? And what spurred some of that research interest was these patient reports and anecdotes about people having tremendous success with being able to substitute cannabis for their opioids. And in the midst of an opioid epidemic, where people, tens of thousands of people have been dying due to opioid overdose, finding a novel strategy to be able to reduce our reliance on opioids is really important. So we're starting to do some of these rigorous studies where we're looking at the potential effects of these cannabinoids, THC and CBD and terpenes, to understand if they can reduce pain and if they can be a substitute for opioids, which would be a safer, potentially a safer therapeutic, because there are less severe adverse effects with these cannabinoids compared to opioids. So that's a really interesting area of study, and it's an area of study that's just starting to bud, specifically because of people's reports and because when you look at different states that have implemented medical cannabis laws, there seems to be a reduction in prescription opioids in specific states. So those data are encouraging.
So, you know, delving a little more into adverse effects, you know, a lot of people ingest, eat cannabis products, and a big issue is dosing. You know, where if they take too much, they can end up in the emergency room. And with all the stress of the pandemic, are you concerned that this is just going to escalate, where people are going to use more and more marijuana, smoking it, and so forth, and that they'll end up with more adverse effects?
Yes. So during this pandemic, where people are being instructed to socially isolate, socially distant, there's employment going down, there's a lot of anxiety. And like you said, a lot of people are struggling now with some serious mental health issues. And it might be hard for them to go see a physician and talk to them about it. There's promise in these types of cannabis products, THC and CBD, to help with some of the primary mental health issues that people are dealing with, like anxiety. And the fact that cannabis dispensaries are considered to be essential businesses, they're open right now. And they were open when everything else was shut down, and there are delivery services. So what we think is happening, and we're doing some research in this area right now, what we think is that people might start using cannabis more frequently because of some of these symptoms and indications that they're having. And at the same time, people might also be using more non-medically, recreationally, because, you know, you're sitting at home, there's not much else to do. And so we are very concerned about the way that people might be using cannabis and cannabinoids during this pandemic, and if they're using it in a safe way. So initially, when the pandemic first came on our radar, end of March, beginning of April, there were actually several articles from, you know, high-level administrators telling people that smoking cannabis, smoking anything right now, you know, it might increase susceptibility of getting the virus, becoming infected, and increase severity of the prognosis, because smoking anything is going to compromise the health of your lungs. And in fact, it seems like a lot of people have heard that message. And another question we're asking is, are people heeding that and switching from their inhaled cannabis, whether it's vaporized or smoked, and are they starting to eat or use more oral products, tinctures, edibles, which goes to the point that you're saying, Dr. Small, is that there's a dosing issue with oral administration, because when people eat an edible, there is a lag between when they eat it and when the effects are felt. And so frequently what happens is that people end up not feeling an effect, and they'll eat a little bit more, and they'll eat a little bit more. And once they start to feel an effect, because they're using it orally, it takes a lot longer to get through the body. And so the effects are a lot longer lasting than when people are inhaling it, which is it comes on quickly and it's short. So it'll be interesting to see what's been happening, especially in California, where there are delivery cannabis services and cannabis is an essential business right now, to see if emergency room visits have gone up specifically because of cannabis intoxication and other side effects.
Here's an interesting question about use. So here's someone who said they recently started using cannabis for insomnia. This person takes no more than 2 hits at a time, no more than 4 or 5 times a week. What are the health risks associated with smoking this amount? Do we know? Is it clear? There's probably a lot of variables there.
Right. So this person is raising some variables here that we touched on a little bit. Part of these variables has to do with what is in the cannabis that this person is using. What's the dose? If it's primarily THC, what is the dose that person is using? The hits, is that coming from a vape pen with a cartridge where we know what's in that cartridge? Is it coming from a regulated dispensary versus unregulated dispensary? Or is it smoked plant material? And what's in that plant material? Are there heavy metals or pesticides? So there are risks inherent just in the product that person is using and not knowing what's in that product. Then there's the risk that might be associated with the smoking or the inhaling, especially during this pandemic time. And there are also other risks that should be considered. So this person is, using cannabis a couple times a week, it sounds like. Generally, one of the primary risks associated with using cannabis every day or repeatedly is developing dependence, where when somebody stops using it, they experience certain withdrawal symptoms. Now, what's interesting is that even though people use cannabis to help with sleep, when people stop using cannabis, their sleep gets significantly disrupted. It's actually really impressive, the effect, if you look at it in the laboratory. And so for somebody who's using cannabis for sleep, they may over time have to be using more in order to get that same effective sleep improvement. And if they stop for a day or two, they might actually have a rebound effect where their sleep becomes significantly disrupted.
Do we know what's going on in the brain to cause that?
That's a good question. When we think about the studies that I'm alluding to are related to THC, and we know that one of the primary ways that THC acts is on a receptor called the cannabinoid receptor, right, conveniently called. And I actually don't know if there have been scientific investigations in animals. I know this hasn't been done in humans, but I don't know if there have been animal studies in humans to demonstrate that it's precisely through that receptor that is promoting those pro-sleep effects that people might be having when they're using cannabis.
So, there's a question here. Is cannabis contraindicated for patients with mild cognitive impairment, dementia, and Alzheimer's? And, let me try to field that. I don't know if you know about it, but I'll try to field it a little bit. There have been some studies looking at cannabis for agitation in dementia. So there's some anecdotal reports that it does calm down some patients, but I think we just don't know enough. And I would have a concern, anybody with dementia, if they get too spaced out from the psychoactive effects, that's going to make it worse.
Yeah. And that's my same feeling as well. Although, I talked about some of these animal studies and they have encouraging findings for small doses of THC to help cognition. Right now, there are so many unknowns. Surprisingly, there haven't been rigorous studies in people with mild cognitive impairment yet to look at, what doses would impair, what doses might help. So I think that extreme caution should be used in those situations.
So somebody asked about FDA oversight, and before you get to that, I just want to commend the Semel Institute and UCLA, our psychiatry department, for recruiting you here to UCLA, because it's a wonderful addition to our faculty. And not only have they recruited you, but they've built a laboratory for you where you can get whatever it is, the government stamped stuff, so you know exactly what you're experimenting with. Plus, you've got these special hoods. And I'm a neighbor on the third floor near you, so I won't get high while you're doing your experiment. So that's wonderful.
Yeah, so thank you. I feel so lucky to be at UCLA and to have colleagues right down the hall from me. We get to talk about certain studies that we might be able to do in the future. But yeah, so doing rigorous studies with cannabis and cannabinoids is really hard. I mean, the obstacles that's 50% of what I do are dealing with the regulatory hurdles. And in fact, when I design studies, my studies are designed specifically around the products that I can give people, because the products that I can give people in the laboratory are so limited, because we have to deal with the FDA, we have to deal with the DEA, and we have to deal with other agencies as well. And so we have to get lots of stamps of approval to do these types of studies. And so Dr. Small was alluding to the fact that we have little smoking chambers, smoking rooms in our laboratory with a designated exhaust system. So when people smoke in our laboratory or vaporize in our laboratory, the exhaust goes all the way up to the top of the building and exits, so that, Dr. Small won't smell it at the other end of the hallway, hopefully.
I want to be able to finish my work.
Right. And in addition to that, we have a very secure storage facility where essentially, you need like your fingerprint and your eyeball scan in order to get into the area where we have our drug. And very few people have those types of licenses in the United States. And this is why, whenever we talk about the effects of cannabis and cannabinoids, I feel like I'm telling everybody disappointing news. It depends. We don't know. We have to do the research, but it's really hard to do. Only a couple of institutions are able to do it. So, we're just plugging away and trying to get it done.
Well, I commend you for your patience and your hard work in that area. And these are the kinds of studies we need to do to really answer the questions, because you're going to have a real understanding of what the dose is, what the ingredients are. But I've got a few other questions I want to get to. One, very practical one. Somebody asked, well, how do you find out if a dispensary is regulated?
So LA County, the Bureau of Cannabis Control in LA County actually has on their website, and Gary, I can send you this website later on. They have a website that lists the dispensaries, and I believe that there are QR codes for dispensaries where you can scan it in to make sure that they are regulated.
Maybe we could link that on our website.
Yeah.
In case people came in late, or you want your friends to see this webinar, we are recording it, and we'll post it on the Longevity Center website. And if you didn't get the address, all you have to do is search online UCLA Longevity Center. You'll land there. Here's another question. I don't know if this is tongue in cheek, but how can a CBD pillowcase help?
It's funny because I had a reporter who I talked to here and there. He reached out to me a year ago, and he said to me, he's like, Ziva, what do you think about this CBD infused athletic wear? And I said to him, I laughed at him. I said, that is a joke. That is a joke. And he's like, no, it's real. here's, you can go to this website and see it. I'm like, I don't believe it. Nobody's going to buy that stuff. 2 months later, the stuff is flying off the shelves, and he gives me a call again. He's like, so what do you think about this CBD infused athletic wear that's selling, $120 for a pair of yoga pants? So it's interesting how there's this industry related to infused products and infused clothes. And the idea here with the pillowcase, I think this is the idea with the pillowcase and with athletic wear, is that when your body heats up, the fabric will release the cannabidiol that is in that fabric, and it will permeate the skin, much like topicals, and you'll reap the benefits of that cannabidiol that's permeating your skin from the pillowcase or from the athletic wear. And because cannabidiol is thought to reduce inflammation and help muscle building, people have kind of, or I should say industry has kind of gone with this approach and saying that, if CBD is going to decrease inflammation, then, use it after your workout, use it during your workout, use it while you sleep so that you get a restful sleep. So interesting industries are popping up.
Yeah. Some people have described it or likened it to the Wild West. It's all over the place. Yeah. And there's similar issues with the supplement industry. That companies can get so-called structure function claims, get their supplement on the shelf without double-blind placebo-controlled studies. So, there are safety issues as well as effectiveness issues. Now, somebody asks, can THC cause permanent brain damage?
I will say that there's what?
I don't know that we know that. I was thinking of the study we did. It doesn't prove it, but people who smoked a lot of marijuana when they were young did have smaller memory centers in the brain. But
right.
It could have been other issues that did that.
Yeah, it could have been, were they also smoking cigarettes and drinking alcohol? What other things were they doing at the same time? So permanent brain damage, or irreversible damage, it's really hard to answer that question from a human perspective, again, because of all these different variables that go into how we treat our brain and bodies over our lifespan. We do know that in animal studies, and you mentioned this, Dr. Small, in your study, that when brains are exposed to drugs or other types of stimuli, they could have long-lasting effects that impact the development, the growth of the brain. And it's been shown, even in utero, that in animals that are exposed to THC in utero or at very vulnerable times of development, those animals can show long-lasting changes in their behavior and their neurobiology. And so this is part of the reason why researchers and clinicians really try and urge adolescents to not experiment with cannabis at a very early age, because based on animal studies, we know that it could have long-lasting effects. Now, that's the case with drugs in general. That's the same with sugar, even. If you expose animals very early on to, certain dietary regimens, that can have that effect. But it is a really important thing to keep in mind.
So here, I just see a question here. It looks interesting. I began smoking marijuana in 2013 for the pain from fibromyalgia and arthritis. Dramatically helpful in treating these disorders. My pulmonologist has encouraged me to explore edibles as opposed to smoking. I've tried it. I find the effects very different. Not high, but very drugged. You know of a non-smoked formulary more similar to smoking? I'm not sure if I understand the question.
So, right. So, this is frequently an issue, and it goes back to just principles of how drugs work. When somebody is inhaling the drug, it's going to enter the bloodstream and the brain at a very different rate than if somebody eats it and it goes through the liver and it gets metabolized, and it happens very slowly. So there's that issue that is related to, how quickly the effect comes on. There are different dosage issues. And so one way that people have looked at figuring out a way to, mimic the effects or the speed of onset of smoked cannabis is if you use it sublingually underneath your tongue, where there's a lot of vasculature there, it might have a faster effect. It might have more of an effect that's like the smoking or inhaling. But there are other ways that people are looking at right now, like nebulizers, inhalers, ways to figure out how these drugs can be used without the pulmonary risk.
So here's an interesting question. Can somebody overdose on cannabis?
But Gary, Dr. Small, I just want to make very clear, my statement that I just made comes from a researcher's perspective, not a clinician. So I'm not giving guidance. I'm just explaining the science. I don't want it to be misinterpreted. So with respect to overdose, when we think of drug overdose, like opioids or benzodiazepines and fatality, overdose that leads to fatality, that cannot happen with cannabis or at least the chemicals in the cannabis plant, as far as we know. Based on animal studies, you can't get to a point where you're using such a high dose that there's fatal, lethal effects from the drug. People might do certain things when they're using the drug, like get into a car accident, but from the drug itself, there really isn't a lethal dose. That being said, people in Colorado and California have been showing up in the emergency rooms for unintentional overdoses, meaning that they have a undesired negative effect from using cannabis. So yes, in that respect, you can overdose, meaning that you can have a negative effect enough that you end up in the emergency room, whether that's because of panic or anxiety or some other various issues.
So that another question. Here's somebody who states that his or her career has been involved in the regulatory and operations of managing clinical trials. With regard to the recruitment and compensation of subjects, could you please comment on enrolling subjects? I assume it's very easy.
Wow, so that's coming from somebody who's regulated clinical studies, so I have to be careful with what I say. So compensating participants for these studies, we usually just follow the same guidelines that are used for all other studies. So generally for studies with patient populations, you compensate them at a minimum for their time. And same thing with our studies where we're looking at cannabis administration in our laboratory. Essentially, you're compensating people for their time. And, it's set at a rate so that it's not coercive. And it's fair, and everything is approved by our ethics board.
Here's a question. I think it's a compliment to your appearance today. They want to know if you see patients.
I do not. I am a scientist. Apart from the participants that we have in our laboratory, I do not see patients.
Okay, but obviously people do want to come in. I mean, you're very knowledgeable about this, and it's terrific. And you're explaining.
And I'm happy to answer questions based on what we know, and point people in the direction if they are interested in seeing a clinician. But I'm more than happy to share what we know about cannabis and cannabinoids. And whereas a lot of people, this isn't a topic that's traditionally taught in medical schools or taught in fellowships or residencies. And so there is a general lack of knowledge, and there is a hesitancy to be able to provide patients with an understanding of what the knowns are and what the unknowns are. So,
we only have a minute or two left, and I apologize to everyone whose question we didn't get to. I think we covered a lot. This has just been such an interesting conversation. I knew it would be, and it looks like just while we were online, we got a total of 70 questions. So it seems like our audience was engaged in the conversation. So hopefully we can have you back and we can continue the discussion.
Definitely.
Yeah. And thank you for ventilating the third floor of the Semel Institute. I can get my job done.
Right.
I want to thank everybody for joining us today and remind you to support, if you're interested to support our Longevity Center, just visit our website. And we really appreciate your support. So thanks to everyone for today, and we'll see you in a few weeks.
Thank you.